Thank you so much for having me. As Tomas sort of introduced, I've been here over the summer working with three amazing fellows that are sitting right over there. And we were working on sort of how do we sort of merge sort of data science and journalism. But it was really more about actually how do you take data, how you take really complex problems and the great minds that are in the Turing Institute, how can you actually apply that to things that affect people in everyday life? And that's what we as journalists try to think about, is we sort of tackle stories and try to tell stories about things in everyday life. But what I'm going to do is take a step back just before we get into talking a little bit about that project. Tomas asked me to come and sort of speak a little bit about sort of what is this whole data journalism world? What is the stuff that journalists are doing? You know, are we, as you know, Trump says, a bunch of vigilantes going and spreading fake news everywhere? What is it that actually we're doing in this day and age? What is it we're doing with technology? What is it we're doing with data? And how can that potentially merge together? So just to give you like a quick overview, obviously I'm just speaking for 40 minutes, but I think to get an idea of what I'm going to discuss, before I was at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, I was head of data at the Times and Sunday Times here in London for 5 years. I was running what I call the computational investigations unit, which is a lot more exciting than it sounds, but actually it was a lot of fun. So what I thought I would do is I would discuss sort of 3 investigations from that world. It was actually quite a very new thing we were bringing in to the Times, and I'll speak a little bit about that. And then I sort of jumped ship, and just this year I started at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, and I'm head of a new project called the Bureau Local, where we are applying the same concepts of computational journalism, but with the task of trying to tackle it for the whole of the UK. How can we help every newsroom? How can we help local journalism? How can we try to rebuild a lot of that by doing investigations that have data points at local levels, but we're not really interrogating them. So that's where I'm at now, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we did with the Turing Institute. So to start off with, when I started at the Times, boring story of my life, but I started as an intern there. I was just sort of helping out. But what we eventually ended up doing is getting hired onto the data team and the digital team at the Times. And sort of at the time when that was being set up, the newspaper sort of said, "There's all this data stuff happening. What do we do with it? There's just, it's all kind of flailing about." They had no idea, and so they just decided to hire. They hired a statistician, a programmer, and myself, trained as a journalist. And just sort of threw us in a room, no direction, figure it out. But I think it was actually the best thing they could have done. We were all very innovative people, very excited people who wanted to tackle things, and we sort of said, what are the strengths of the Times? How can we bring our strengths and the strengths of the Times? And the truth is that data journalism is something that was thrown around a lot at that time. So I don't know how many people are familiar with the Guardian's data blog. This was sort of the first foray into bringing data into people's lives that was a little bit more accessible. So they had a blog and they do cool visualizations. So for a long time, data journalism was visualization, really, at least in our media space. A lot of journalists just got really excited that they could take a bit of information released from the ONS or something and just throw it up and make something spin and move. And for a while, that's what data journalism was. And the truth was, at the Times, we thought, well, actually, that's not that's not really our strength, and that's not really what we want to do. And so we kind of thought, data journalism, the idea of taking complex data sets and bringing it to people and helping people understand that's not a new concept to journalism. So taking the complex, making it simple, that's not new. Data visualization is not new. We've been doing that since the beginning of printing at the Times. These are sort of amazing historic visualizations that I found in the archives. None of that's new. So what we had to do is invent what is the new thing that we can bring. And the new thing is obviously the method in which we do that. So visualizing isn't new and storytelling isn't new, but computational method is new. So the way in which we do that. And so that's what we brought to the Times. And I won't go into the boring story of how we built that, because it was a long, boring process. It started with me walking in the newsroom excited to do computational journalism, and the first thing I was asked to do was to fix the printer, because obviously that's what we do if we're tech and data people. But anyways, we built all that. Probably one of the biggest stories that I'm sort of known for at the Times and the Sunday Times was breaking the doping scandal for the Sunday Times. So this was a story in which we revealed that Russian athletes had highly suspicious levels of blood doping, and it led obviously to an inquiry. It led to potential Russian ban from the former Olympics. It led to a world the World Agency to do an inquiry into that, and actually our data was submitted to the World Anti-Doping Agency's submission. We anonymized the data and helped sort of provide that in the public interest. So that led to quite a big story. I bring this up because actually the three things I chose to bring up from the Times and the Sunday Times were sort of the nerdiest of them. And I thought this room might appreciate that. In the world of journalism, if I talk about my stories, I don't really talk about the nitty gritty of it. But I think this space would do that. So we were using R for one of the first times in the newsroom on this piece, which some of you in this room might use that as a to do some of your analysis. Essentially what we had is we had a whistleblower that came forward and said they'd been working at the International Federation. They had said they'd seen this for ages. I think a lot of people assumed and knew that doping had been happening, but there was no proof of it. And that's the beautiful thing about data, isn't it? That we actually have evidence in spaces that we didn't before. So someone had brought forward a database of the blood results of athletes over 12 years of time. And the great thing about it was the Sunday Times had already broken the story of Lance Armstrong. They knew that the Sunday Times was really interested in this stuff. We had broken the story on FIFA as well. So this was the sort of big story that we revealed, that there had been a sort of secret bid and bribery that had happened for Qatar to win the World Cup. And that had been through a massive database as well. So they had come to us saying, we know you can do data, we know you can do sport, but we can't figure out what to do with this database of blood results. So each athlete that had been recorded in the data set had been measured. This is when you go in, you've got to be checked to make sure that you're clean to compete. And sometimes it was Olympics and World Championship events, but sometimes they were test rounds or whatever. Each entry was every unique blood result. Athletes often will have many blood tests. So we've got sort of multiple entries of athletes. We've got multiple measures of blood in there. We have just this huge dump. So we ended up working with the leading experts on anti-doping who measure that. They helped us with the formula. We combined the data set together. We applied the formula differently for men and women. We essentially sort of worked with them, made our own database of all the medal-winning athletes in the World Championships and the Olympics. In the endurance events, we were sort of tipped off that this often happens in endurance events, sort of merge those things together. We were analyzing it over time as well, so we never accused an individual athlete, and we never pointed to anyone that had just had one abnormal measure of their blood. We used what's called a biological passport, so we were also looking at a single person over time, how many fluctuations are happening with that. I learned a lot about blood when doing this story. Turns out, as crazy as it sounds, a lot of these people do transfusions to hide that they're doping as well. So they pump clean blood in for the test and then pump their blood back in afterwards. So what we're also looking for is big spikes up and down in the tests. We're looking for a lot of different things. Our statistician who worked on the piece was using R to sort of measure this over time to do it very quickly. It was an amazing effort in which we had been able to apply multiple formulas, build multiple databases, do loads of matching, looking at trends over time, working with experts that lived in Australia and Germany and here. And the fastest way we could do that actually was with pushing that through sort of our reporting. Every time we got a new calculation in from a scientist, we were pumping that through. So it was a really exciting thing in the newsroom. Saw for the first time actually the power that can happen when you have someone who understands data and who can process it in a way that they couldn't before. So I think that's the big thing that we think about when I try to explain in the newsroom. What we do is sort of we use computers to get stories in a way that that a human couldn't do alone. And that's the way that our newsroom thinks about it. Is a human could maybe sit down and do all of that, but it would take ages, and newsrooms don't have time, and a lot of people don't have time, even in the academic world. And so I think what it is, it's about how do we get there faster, and how do we dig deeper, and how do we process more information that a human could do by themselves. And that's the most exciting thing, and that's the thing that we were bringing. One of the other pieces that I did for the Times was looking into divid, which is sort of the international funding that we give to developing countries. So this is the percentage of GDP that your tax-paying money goes towards, and it goes out to the developing world. Now, this database was not leaked. This was a publicly available data set. It's out. It's actually one of the most transparent and one of the cleanest data sets. They have an API. You can sort of go in. You can dig in the data. But the thing that we found in the data that you didn't have it is that a lot of the questions that journalists have that actually can't be answered. And they said, well, who is the money going to, and what kind of companies are they, and where are those companies based, and what's sort of happening? So we sort of did this exercise here. I love a Sankey graph. I don't know how many of you use it, but I do love a flowing Sankey graph. So we had actually gone through the data set and did a lot of that sort of matching again. So you could have manually gone through each entry and said, okay, where is that organization? And what a journalist would have normally done, Google it, find out, okay, I'll add a new column in saying this organization is based here, or whatever that is. But what we did instead is we ran it through things like Company House. We ran it through existing databases that could already produce for us what that organization might be. And so we did a lot of that heavy work, but there was, of course, some manual elements on it as well. And we, for the first time, took that data set and identified where actually that company that was getting, or the organization that was getting the funding was from. Turns out that there's quite a bit actually circulating back into the UK, despite this being a international federation. And then on top of that, that analysis found that it was basically coming back into a lot of consultancy companies as well. So that was one of our kind of big story, was that. And I think for me what was a really fascinating story is this sort of branch that's sort of coming out on the side, if you can see. That was actually unaccounted for money. So we had what we called a black hole, which was something that just money could not be accounted for. There were ones that were just labeled as unknown, and there were a few other sort of things that were sort of partially complete. But for our own transparency perspective, we don't, if your tax-paying money is going into the developing world and we're trying to help solve some of the most pressing problems, why is some of this money sort of missing off, especially when we're noticing they found ways to sort of bring that money right back into the UK, into a lot of these consultancy firms. So that was a huge, sort of a huge effort in sort of building our own SQL database, making all of that transparent, making all of that open, putting our tagging system out there, improving on the data set. We wrote a big, sort of big piece that's saying if you want transparency, you can't have patchy numbers. We had many people who work within that saying that this was, a really good push in the direction of what we needed. So we sort of see this space as, computational journalism is both merging into this sort of civic world and in the journalism world, which is why obviously I'm showing these today. The last one I'll show from the Times is probably it's sort of one of my favorites, I guess. We ahead of Brexit, but before that, for the last general election back in 2015, we were sat out to do just as every other data journalism unit does. What you might realize when you look at the newspapers, or when you pick up a paper, is that if they get very excited about elections, every newsroom and every data team and every newsroom wants to be the ones that predict. They want to be able to predict the seats, and they want to have these great things. And that's what everybody was trying to do in 2015. They were taking polling data and trying to do all kinds of analysis. I'm very proud of the incredible team that I had at the Times. My statistician at the time was starting to look at the data set, and we were doing some pieces and we felt comfortable with when we were aggregating on a national level. But the moment we started trying to break down and looking on seat by seat level, I sort of had the moment when we started saying, well, actually, something's not right here. The margins are really wide. The sample sizes are too small in some of these spaces. And oftentimes, if they just didn't have enough data on a certain seat, they would just pull the national average just straight down and stick it on that. And he flagged this up and said, something's not right. This isn't right. I don't feel comfortable using this. I don't feel comfortable. I don't have enough information. It's not accurate enough to do seat level predictions. We sat down and we looked at all of it and sort of made the very easy decision, but the very hard one to enforce, obviously, which is that we weren't going to use polling data ahead of the 2015 general election. My boss, of course, said, why are you so special? Everybody else is doing it. Why do you think that you're so elevated above that space? But we stuck our ground, and obviously, as you might know now, the polls were hugely off, and we were very proud of that. But obviously, as journalists, you can't just say, we're not going to use that data. We still had to cover the story. So this very kind of half-broken decision tree is one of the things that we did. So what we said is, okay, what do we trust? We trusted the census, which was obviously not hugely up to date, but we trusted the census. We trusted things like the labor force survey. We trusted there was a lot of quite robust surveys out there that had that. And then obviously we say, well, we trust the actual results on the night. So if you take that, and how can we creatively think about ways that we can tell really great stories for the election on that? So what we did is we built this robust data set on every seat, on everything that you might want to know, or what we thought indicators that we might want to know about the election: education levels, sort of crime levels, lots of different things, just built this really robust set of that. And we poured in last election and some of the polling data into this decision tree, kind of machine learning algorithm, which some of you probably already know, very simple, but for us was sort of huge in the newsroom to be able to say, how can this sort of tell us deciding factors of why or what, people were voting which way or not. So ahead of time, yeah?
I'm just curious, what were the kind of factors that went into you deciding whether you trusted a database or not?
Well, I think the fact that, like the things that we mentioned earlier about having a really robust sample size for the areas that we're looking at, ones that we know were quite rigorously tested and have been used in the past, so that could be cross-referenced. It tended to be those data sets. So it was mainly like some things like the census, and I think the labor force survey, and maybe, I'm trying to remember the other one. Yeah, really large scale ones that we had. Because to be honest, like on a local level, you don't always have a really robust level of data. So we were using some quite big ones. Yeah, and so then what we did is we just sort of let the machine sort of tell us which way it went. So we did that during the general election, and we also did this during the Brexit campaign. And as you can kind of, I don't know if you noticed our decision tree. So actually, I split this for the slide, so they should be sitting on top of each other. And what the interesting thing here is we did the same thing, and we did this live on the day as well. So we prepped it ahead of time, and then we did some testing on it, and then went live on the day. So as the results are coming in, we're pouring the information in. So as you can see, from the 382 local authorities, the first thing that came up was we had put a data set in there on industry, like the types of industry that each of these areas, people that work in. And the first thing that came up was manufacturing. And it said, well, we phrased it this way, obviously, but are there more than 7% of jobs in that seat that are based on manufacturing? And obviously the algorithm shows us that 7% was a unique breaking point. 200 of those those local authorities voted leave that had that as an indicator. And then it goes on to look at education. But this is the kind of way that we presented it later. Actually, we just sort of took that and played with it. So unsurprisingly, I think as we could think now, manufacturing, education, house prices and pay, which are pretty similar measures as you'd probably think, were huge indicators. So you've got, so in manufacturing, you had 230 areas where, like I said, where that 7% was there. We had education on there, so those who didn't have at least, what we just said is kind of quite a high level of scoring on GCSEs. Interestingly, actually, on the pay, it broke at below 23%. So if it looked at the algorithm and said 23% was the unique breaking point if that was the average pay. And interestingly, it broke on the national average for house prices as well, exactly that. So this for us was huge. This for us is what kind of I call robot journalism, at least what I was calling it when I was at the Times, which is this sort of idea of not using robots to replace journalists, but using robots, computers essentially to get us to those stories in a way that we couldn't. So on the day of the referendum, we had done sort of all of this, right? So we had done this and published this in a piece, and we started explaining what was out. We pushed out these different kind of indicators out on social media and had written sort of more in-depth pieces on these specific issues. And we also produced 4 pages in print for the paper on that single day. Now, a human in the newsroom might not have been able to actually do all of that, but our team was able to kind of obviously produce a lot of analysis. And the other big thing for us was that these sort of cards and these indicators, the moment that the final results dropped in, we had this within a half hour. And we had started tweeting that. As everyone's sort of running around, what's happening, Brexit's happening, we, again, didn't explain why people voted Brexit, but we were able to bring some very clear analysis. And the most interesting thing for me is a human could not have done that. The Times is really well known for its political analysts, but an analyst could not have done what we did in a half hour. And that's, I think, what the most interesting thing, I think, that sort of computer scientists and computational method sort of brings to this space. And that's the robot kind of journalism I talk about. So anyways, that's sort of my few of the kind of highlights of the types of things I was doing at the Times. And then, as I sort of mentioned, I decided to leave. It was a fantastic job at the Bureau that was essentially trying to say, can we do what you're doing at the Times, but can you do it for the whole country? Can we do it for every newsroom? How can the kind of work on data actually benefit loads of people? How can we create a central place and help resource local newsrooms that are really hurting? People aren't getting information, not being able to hold power to account on a local level. This is, we're seeing a democratic deficit in our society, I think, in that space. We're watching access to, the accountability locally, it just isn't there. It's all focused sort of in London. And I was very intrigued by this, not only because this is very much the area that I want to work in, but as the Times, obviously, we sort of, the main thing what you do is you crunch, get that big number, a total at the bottom, throw that on the front page and move on. And every data point within there tells so many stories of those communities in Manchester and Liverpool and Glasgow and Cornwall, all of it, and we just sort of leave them to be. So sort of we decided, I decided to take on this new task of trying to figure out how can we actually look at national data sets and sort of do this kind of method and do these sort of resources that most people don't have, but actually help people get and tell those stories within these sort of much bigger ones. Because actually we often find when people read data stories, it just whoosh goes over them. When you read something a million, a billion, what does that even mean to your life? And we're finding a lot of people really struggle with what that is. So anyways, we launched a Bureau Local. So the aims of the project are to do that. As Tomas sort of said earlier, my big thing is about not just making things available, but making things accessible, which is really, really important to me. I think the tech community has done a lot to really open up a lot of data sets. I think there's a lot more we can do on that, but actually the accessibility of that. How can everyday people feel empowered with that kind of information? How can journalists actually interrogate it and tell really important stories? And I just don't think that we're doing that. And I think there's a really great opportunity, which is why I work with statisticians and academics a lot. How can we sort of merge that? How can sort of the great minds of people in this room and, and people in this type of community help kind of actually bridge that gap? I think we really need to kind of make this working in everyday public life. So big thing is, how can we open up data sets, make them more accessible? Other goal of this project is to really get local public interest stories out. So how can we hold power to account and get sort of investigations happening on a local level? And then the bigger thing actually is building a network of people who work with this. So right now, since we launched about 8 months ago now, we have 400 people who've signed up as members of us, and that's journalists, technologists, lawyers, teachers, people who just want to hold power to account. And we've been collaborating together on stories. A month after we launched, Theresa May decided to ruin my life and call a snap election, and I had to try to throw together, I had to figure out how we were going to cover that within 2 months of a brand new team and a brand new project, but we did an amazing job. We partnered, I thought this would be interesting to you, we partnered with a sort of Chrome plugin / civic tech app called Who Targets Me, and essentially it was a Chrome plugin that was scraping your sort of Facebook page and pulling out all the Facebook ads that were targeting you. And it would sort of empower you to sort of see what they were on your own page. But they obviously had a database that they were collecting on that. There were 10,000 people in the UK that actually used that. This was sort of the largest group that's ever sort of done that. There's been the New York Times and some people over in Berlin as well during the elections have tried to take this on, but no one's actually ever had it. And I find that really fascinating. The UK had the largest sort of volunteer uptake of this. And so we analyzed a lot of that data. We allowed a lot of local papers to sort of report the sort of unique targeting that was happening to them. Now, of course, there wasn't actually huge wrongdoing. I don't know if that, and I don't think that was necessarily the goal, is to prove the wrongdoing, but it was about bringing that, actually sort of making that kind of that heavy data stuff that people don't get much more into the public space. One of our sort of biggest one, I think, was 2 days before the election, we announced in this piece that we thought that there were 70 seats that could potentially flip, that had the power to flip by new voters alone, and that could obviously dent May's majority. We were laughed at, of course. Theresa May's majority will not be done just she's going to swing through with flying colors. But obviously, as you know, I've been in this for a little while, and I know a lot of people say that about a lot of the elections. What we did is we just felt, my job at the time is to really resource newsrooms and local newsrooms, and we were finding people saying, we don't have the resources. We have 2 months to try to get through this election. There's nothing we can do. There's nothing we can do. Theresa May is going to walk straight in. So we were trying to figure out, well, what can people do? And I think there was a lot of talk about tactical voting at the time. And so we were trying to play with that idea. How can we play with that concept of people wanting to feel individually empowered? So we said, well, who are the power groups? Who are the people who hold the power in this election? And so again, we built a really nice, robust data set of different people around the UK. We thought, okay, why don't we just get registration figures and start having a look at that? Turns out registration figures are not centralized. So we modeled it, and we essentially used the latest registration figures that finished at the end of last year, and then looked at kind of the website that has live applications and registrations, and sort of did a bit of modeling on that for a local level to sort of predict what we thought would be on each seat. We ran a hack day in 5 cities, which was super exciting. This is pictures of people who are in the different rooms in Glasgow, Birmingham, Bournemouth, London, and where am I missing? Was it Manchester? Cardiff. And so we got loads of people in a room a week before and said, we've got this data set, what can we do with it? I scattered my statisticians that I had sort of been working with around in the different cities, and what resulted was the story, as I just told you. We had someone sort of saying, well, I know in my seat, in my area, there's all, what you're showing me is that there are loads of new registrations in my seat, and also UKIP isn't standing anymore in the seat, and they had a couple thousand here, and the Greens aren't standing in my seat anymore, and they had a couple thousand here. But my seat only won by a margin of 1,000 last time. So what we were noticing actually is if you start looking at these new registrations and places where people were no longer standing, you had the potential, and what we were going to report on, what was the potential that could happen. Now, we weren't predicting, we weren't saying these are all going to flip, but people, if they chose to, had the potential to flip those seats. It led to sort of front pages in local papers around the country, very specific to their areas, saying we have this many new voters or whatever that is. It's also important to mention that once we sort of narrowed down, looking at the 70, we called each of them up in their offices and got the official numbers of the registration figures. Because obviously we had to model for the sort of whole scale, but turned out we were off by less than 1%. But we used the actual numbers in all of our pieces, so everything was quite accurate. So that was another huge win for the project, and I think another indication of how sort of the power of people kind of working in this space. And the last 2 things I'll just mention are, we just had 2 stories out. In the past 2 weeks, I'm absolutely exhausted. We're a team of 4 doing all of this, so it's very hardwired. But basically, 2 pieces. One came, which was this one, which we looked at a data set on nationality by those arrested on in-country spot checks. Turns out Brits are the largest nationality stopped, which is perplexing considering these are specifically for the crime of being in the country illegally, so therefore they cannot commit these crimes. They're meant to be intelligence-led. This was a data set that took a massive fight with the Home Office through FOIs. We had to go through the Information Commissioner to get it. This was sourced from our community itself, so this was from a reporter in our network out in Bristol who got the data and said, I want to share it with our network. We collaborated on it together and had amazing pieces that were out. We've had 8 MPs call for action off the back of it, and we only just revealed this the other day. This on Monday. It was on Channel 4 the other night, which is this. We've spent basically 5 months on this, working with local reporters all around the country, filling in the gaps of a lot of data sets on domestic violence cuts. And this was through FOIs, this was through creating our own surveys and going to refuge managers. We were collecting information systematically, but locally. And this was like just a very, very, very powerful piece that has been showing the kind of women that are being turned away and the cuts that are happening for domestic violence refugees. So that's sort of the Bureau Local as we know it, and as it's been in our 8 months. As you can see, I think at the heart of that is really trying to see how can we use the greatest sort of terms of innovation in tech and bring it into journalism. The last thing I mentioned, which is the most random slide, but my fellows hopefully will know what I'm talking about. I got to spend a summer here with the 3 fellows, as I mentioned right there in the back, who are absolutely wonderful. I came to them with quite a daunting task, which is I want to follow the money, EU funds to the UK. I want to see where it's going locally. I want to know exactly where money from the EU to the UK is, and I want us to trace that down so that individual people feel empowered to know where are there funds in my area or not. Unfortunately, I think this maybe should have been done before the referendum, but apparently it wasn't. And I'm not doing this retrospectively because because of any position I have on the referendum. I think it's actually hugely important as we go forward that local communities feel empowered to know, X job center was funded by this, what's going to happen to that job center now, and that they feel empowered, like I said, to be able to demand and know what is going to happen to this. Is the government going to, is they going to replace that? Are those things going to be cut? But if you don't know, then you can't demand or ask of it or feel empowered by it. This is a lot to do with transparency. Put this massive sort of task on those 3. We spent quite a summer finding out actually this is an extremely complicated data set. The EU sort of have a publishing standard, which is quite good, but when it actually comes, once that hits over into the UK to finish it, turns out that there's quite a lot happening there. So our very first task was figuring out what is there, what isn't, and what this is actually is showing the gaps in the data set. Actually, if you have to think of it a little bit more if it was flipped the other way, because we're trying to find the tracing down, right? Where is the money going? But I mean, obviously, you can think of it either way. But this was just an exercise that we did with the fellows to sort of say, you have to begin by knowing what is there and what isn't there. And this kind of comes back to the piece I spoke about earlier about black holes. It turns out there are a lot of black holes in terms of transparency and knowledge around where a lot of that funding is happening on the local level. And what we ended up doing with them is playing with playing kind of with the ideas of not only just how do we visualize this, how do we tell it, how do we understand it, but they decided to take 2 strands from 2 different cities and see how far can we go. If I live in Liverpool and I want to know, that apprentice program that I heard about, how much money of that actually is coming there, or how much actually does my area receive from it? Just trying to come from an everyday person, they tried to sit themselves in the seat of somebody else and think about that. And actually, what they ended up doing with us is we ended up documenting the process of following the data and where the gaps are and where the problems are and how we fix it. So what we're planning to do now, I'm not giving up on it. I think the Turing Institute is meant to be tackling the most challenging issues of our time. I think this is one of those, especially on how it's going to affect the UK, how it's going to affect everyday people. So we've done an amazing first task at sort of identifying that and being able to put those narratives through. And what I really want to do next, potentially, is turn this into sort of an interactive database and call on civic tech groups, interested people of our network to say, how can we start filling in these gaps? Because I don't think it can be done alone. And I think this is the thing about collaboration that I talked about earlier, having people around the country volunteer and work together. This is sort of the next task that I'm going to do, is potentially see how can we do that? Can I have someone sort of say, I'll take this chunk right here and I'll start really digging into it? Because some of it just it's not in a machine readable format, but they're in loads of PDF files on a report somewhere. Is that can we identify that? Can we trace that down? Are there things that we will notice are problems that happen across the board that we can solve programmatically? But that's kind of the next task at hand. If that's something of interest, maybe that's one of the discussions that people might want to tackle in the afternoon, or approach us later. But I think that's pretty much an overview of what that is. And I'm really honored to be able to come and speak to you all today on this. Because I really do believe that the kind of work a lot of you are doing at the Turing Institute is absolutely fascinating and important, and hopefully you've kind of gotten a good picture about actually how a lot of your work and a lot of the work that you kind of do is in awe of many journalists and many people in the kind of public space, and how we can sort of potentially bridge that gap.
Thank you.
That's for me.